Hi, and welcome to another session of Searching for Answers. We're still searching, and we're glad you're here searching along with us. So let's invite you to grab your Bibles, whatever translation, whatever version. If you have several, all the better. Line them up because it's good to be able to compare them. We are a special panel here this evening. We're particularly grateful, even though it's an all-male chorus this time. But nonetheless, we are grateful for our participants, starting with Leo Ranzelin over here, the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Religion in the School of Religion at Loma Linda University, and a New Testament scholar. Dr. William Johnson, whose life has been focused through the years, hasn't it, in a way, on this fascinating book. Seventh-day Adventists turn to this book mostly looking for doctrinal support, and that has some legitimacy, but you have mined it much more deeply, I think, Bill. A particular pleasure to welcome for this session Dr. Eric Webster. Dr. Webster, pastor in South Africa, in the South Africa Union, for a lifetime. He has his doctoral degree in theology and edited the South African Signs of the Times journal for years, 22 years, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
And a marathon and half-marathon runner.
That sounds rather intimidating.
Yes, it is. I'm intimidated. I would never challenge you on that at all. And
let's be humble.
And Dr. Bernard Taylor, Old Testament scholar, expert in the languages of Scripture, Hebrew and Greek as well. We're particularly glad that we have your expertise and background here.
Right.
Last time, when we talked together, we were just getting into chapter 10, which winds up an extended argument, right, Leo? Yes. Goes right through from chapters 8 and 9. It's the heart of this letter, heart of a sermon, actually, isn't it? But that heart comes out in the opening verses of chapter 10, where it says that the sacrifices can never quite get us there.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
They never, those of us, it says, who have come approaching the altar, the temple, over and over, it never quite gets us there, does it?
Right.
So you were reading that. I invite you to quickly review any of that you want to say, and then carry us forward a few more verses, if you would. Take us through the first 10 verses of the chapter, Leo.
If I could just add to your introductory comments, nicely stated, because I think this homily in chapters basically 1 through 9 has sketched an incredible, grand portrait of what Jesus has done, how magnificent he is. And so like a good homiletician, he pauses. And I believe that 10:1 through 18 is a recapitulation. It is a summary of the key themes of this homily. And so he wants to underscore some points that are really important to him. What he did, as you noted here in the first part of chapter 10, is underscore the limitations of the law and its provisions for bringing the worshiper access to the very presence of God. So now, in chapter 10, verse 5, there's a therefore. In light of those inadequacies and limitations of the law and its inability to bring the worshiper into the presence of God, therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, now he's going to talk about the incarnation, Christ's superior sacrifice. He says, sacrifice and offering you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sins you have taken no pleasure in. Then he said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of a book it has been written of me, to do your will, O God. Now when he says above, sacrifices and offerings and whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sins you have not desired, nor have you taken pleasure in them, which are offered according to the law. Then he said, behold, I have come to do your will. And if I could just pause, and I hopefully need to talk about 9b, because many a New Testament scholar thinks that 9b is an epoch-making statement. He abolishes the first in order that he might establish the second. By this will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all.
I think you're right that this is a clear recapitulation, but it's in very punchy ways, isn't it?
Right.
Anything you want to pick up on in what you've just read here?
Well, I think he makes 2 points. Again, he underscores the powerlessness of the sacrifices, right? And so we kind of get a prophetic critique here of the Levitical sacrificial system.
That's right.
Where you see again and again in Israel's scriptures that God prefers a consecrated human heart, obedience over against sacrifice. So that's clearly there. And I think he also underscores the willing obedience of Jesus Christ. He has come to do your will. That's why he enters into the world, to achieve God's redemptive purposes for him.
And I suppose he takes the place, Christ himself takes the place of all of these limited sacrifices of the past as he offers himself. Isn't that right? He's the perfect offering.
It kind of ratifies them, doesn't it? As if they have never come into their own in any way, and except as they're supplanted or replaced by Jesus, the Son.
Yes,
right.
It would seem that way.
Yeah, Bernard, what do you think?
Well, you got a quotation from the Old Testament.
Right.
I saved that for you.
And I've given voice to it a while ago because we haven't had such quotations for some time. And of course, in early on, there was Psalm 95 was a key passage.
Yeah.
But the question, I think, lying behind this, putting the reader into the focus, the Jewish Christians, is how are you going to establish this from the Old Testament? It's all very well to come along and say, as Christians, everything changed.
Right.
But was this anticipated in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, or in the Septuagint, which is the one that is continually quoted here?
Right.
And the apostle finds a passage which in the Septuagint reads in a manner different from the Hebrew,
That's important.
but which is perfect for what he is saying, because it's not just the words. You know, you can utter words but not have the meaning behind it. But he reads it as the words of Christ. And verse 5, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired. There you have it, the Old Testament. Now, of course, we could go to Psalm 51. That desirous not sacrifice, else I would offer it. Forgive me for flipping back to the King James, but that's the form in which I learned it. And but a body you have prepared for me. Now, nobody is going to have understood this in quite this way prior to when Christ comes, but when this light, which casts the shadow of the Old Testament, was brought to bear upon the text, things look different.
Comes into focus in a new way,
Things
doesn't
come
it?
into focus that were in the shadows before. And here is something that is giving voice to what the apostle has said, and his summary comes from the book of Psalms. It's chapter 40, verses 6 to 8, in the Greek translation, the Septuagint. Reading on. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, see, God, I have come to do your will, O God. In the scroll of the book it is written of me. So here is a passage without any fancy footwork or sleight of voice in connection with it, says exactly what the prophet is bringing to his hearers, these Jewish Christians, that was there all along, but they missed it because they hadn't seen the light from Christ. And the knowledge of Scripture, which this represents, and the depth of thought that has enabled a verse like this to come into focus and be presented at this key point. I mean, this is a term paper? Whoa. We'd be willing to offer a doctorate on the paper.
Yes.
This is incredible, the way this verse... And then some further, when he said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. These are offered according to the law. Then he added, see, I have come to do your will. And that, of course, is what Jesus came to do, to show us a way and to provide the way. And
also, the argument doesn't come from the author of the book of Hebrews, but it comes from Jesus himself, doesn't it?
Right. It's understood in that fashion. And in my graduate studies, I studied 2 years of Syriac in a Jewish institution, and the professor had us reading the writings of the Syrian father Afraat. And these were arguments for Christ being God and that sort of thing. And they were not well done. They were not well done. They were not convincing. It was embarrassing for us to have to translate these. But it serves to highlight how incredible that one could find something without having to change anything that gave such voice to the sentiment of
with
passion.
full legitimacy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Bill, what do you think?
Well, I'm trying to put myself back there at the time this was written.
Yeah.
Okay? And especially if I've come out of a Jewish background.
Right.
Here's this temple, which is magnificent. Wonderful, glorious structure. And all this round of sacrifices, how would this argument hit me, you know? It's very clearly saying that that whole system is flawed, okay? Even though it has from God, it is flawed in itself in terms of doing the job of taking care of the human problem. So I think maybe he felt the need to go into so much detail because of that background of the reader to make the case. But, you know, I've thought of this passage, especially verse 4 that we just passed by. It's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. And of course it is, you know. If in my rage I rise up and kill someone, what do I do to make that right? What do I do? Okay. Do I take a sheep and kill it? How does that make it right? You have a dead man. The man is still dead, but you now have a dead animal. Okay. 100, 1,000. It had to be something more than animal blood.
But you can also understand why the Jews in the time of Christ, like Saul, were so opposed to Christianity and to Christ because it was doing away with all of these things which they thought was without a flaw.
Yeah.
Isn't that right?
Yes.
I mean, Saul persecuted the Christians and thought that this Jesus was an imposter. Until divine light struck him on the Damascus Road.
Let me take you back to the Old Testament. Micah chapter 6 and reading from verse 6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old. What a gift that is, because after a year and all the feeding, you throw it away, but it never reaches the maturity when it can be of greatest benefit. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? A very poignant expression follows, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul. Here in the Old Testament is the sense of the inadequacy of it,
Yeah.
and crying out for something more.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love chesed, covenant loyalty. We have no English word for that. And to walk humbly with your God.
Yeah.
Such an incredible statement. It's not found in sacrifices. It's found in a relationship, and it's back the front. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. We learn God first, others second, yourself last. And interpersonal, Amos and Micah and their message of social justice.
And how many hundreds of years was that before Christ came? What?
Yeah,
a number,
800-900
years that this light was dawning on
Yes,
them.
yes.
I love that passage. My favorite, I think, in the Old Testament.
Yes, I think so. I think it's the pinnacle, the Everest of the Old Testament. And so simply expressed.
Yeah.
I think it represents the first, apologies, Leo, the first opening up of the gap between the physical and the spiritual. Fruit of my body, sin of my soul. And here is the first hint of daylight, you know, that's saying there's a polarity there that such that one cannot touch the other fully and adequately. I overspoke.
No,
over you,
nicely stated.
Leo,
I just
but-
want to, what Dr. Taylor and Dr. Johnson said, elaborate a little more fully on that as I immerse myself perhaps in the audience of those Jewish Christians.
Yeah.
I might have thought, you know, this author is sketching in magnificent ways the person and work of Christ, you know, making a case for something new. Perhaps he's overstating that. But then this author says, okay, I'm going to critique this with Israel's scriptures themselves. And so we've got Jeremiah 31, right?
Yeah.
That clearly speaks to the reality, the dawning of a new day, which, by the way, some NT scholars think that this entire homily is all about unpacking the Jeremiah 31 passage. And then he also brings to light those of you that are perhaps a little too wrapped up with ritual, right? The sacrificial system. You need to remember, as Dr. Taylor says, these prophetic critiques of ritual, that it's not just about ritual, it's about a consecrated, obedient heart that's dedicated to God, you know. That's what's really important, and those texts that you alluded to are there. So he goes to the Old Testament itself to critique, and it seems to me that would carry a lot of weight with that audience, would it not?
Yeah.
Using those OT texts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. There are two streams of Judaism represented in the Old Testament. Our viewers, I think, are familiar with this, but we'll just say it quickly. There is the sacrificial system, the rituals, the temple, the offerings, the sacrifices, all of the ceremonies.
Right.
There is also the voice of the prophet, whatever prophet. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, right down to Malachi.
Right.
People who were offbeat, sometimes people who lived out in the desert, needed a shave and a haircut and a shower, but and they did not hang out in the temple except to call down condemnation. They did not hang out in the king's palaces because the kings did not like these people. But their message was a very different one.
Yeah.
It was a pathway of the pure heart and of social justice, of loving kindness to fellow man. Now, when we come down to the New Testament then, by and large, the New Testament, starting with Jesus, seems to build primarily on those prophets. You've said this well already, Leo, so I will not belabor it. When you say prophetic, this is what you're meaning. That Jesus himself says, I desire mercy,
Right.
not sacrifice.
Exactly.
There's the split right there. And Jesus is aligning himself with the mercy side more than the sacrifice side. Paul himself, for all of his struggles and the road to Damascus and all the rest, lines himself up with that side as well. He says, we are saved by grace through faith, through God's mercy, and we extend God's mercy to others. What makes Hebrews different is precisely that it does nonetheless take advantage of and hook back into the temple, the ritual, the sacrifices, the ceremony.
Right.
It is unique in that regard. And Bill, you've reminded us, this is not Paul. The fancy language is that this is cultic language, not juridical or something else like that. But now we have a moment of alignment, yes, even with Paul's strategy, because it's a moment that reaches back to the prophets in the Old Testament and lines up with them against the ceremonial as being not fully efficacious. On the one hand, then, Hebrews wants to say, yes, Christ is the fulfillment of all that had value. It pointed in a particular direction, not fully fulfilled, but nonetheless of great value. That's a unique argument in Hebrews. But Hebrews never carries that through all the way.
Right.
When it comes to crunch time, Hebrews 2 lines up with the prophetic voice and reminds us that the prophets criticized the ceremonial as inadequate.
Right.
So we have this one moment that cuts against the strategy of the whole book, it seems to me. Huh?
Could it be?
Nicely put.
Could there be a danger even while in the Old Testament there was this struggle, they couldn't fully understand it, and they slipped into ritualism? Now we're in the, as it were, new dispensation. Christ is here, a new age, as it were. We have it all. Is there any danger that we could slip into formalism and ritualism as Christians or as Adventists? Any danger? Or is it all fine for us in New Testament times?
I think that is one of the most perceptive questions we can ask out of this. Is it possible that we too need to remind ourselves that ritual has meaning, ritual has power, ritual changes things, it makes a difference in our lives, but ultimately we are summoned to a different modality, a different way of thinking about salvation and forgiveness. Isn't it so?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right.
Bernard, I think I ran past you a moment ago.
No,
You had
no. But thank you for thinking so. Well, I think we have a sense of agreement here, and I think it's important and it's significant because I can't see the plain meaning of the text being otherwise. But of course, we've toyed with verse 4, impossible for the blood. Well, no, verse 3 actually. Well, let me go back to 10:1. Since the law has only a shadow of the good things to come and not the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered year after year, make perfect those who approach. Otherwise, would they not have ceased being offered, since the worshippers, cleansed once for all, would no longer have any consciousness of sin? But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sin year after year. And the question is the apostle offering the readers a level of certainty that will enable them not only to have their sins forgiven, but no longer have any consciousness of sin? Or is this like Paul, the now and the not yet? By faith we have it, and the not yet. And I'm inclined to think that the apostle really means to say that in the 21st century, We may yet not be grasping the full force of this, and we have not seen its limits because we have not strained for its limits. And we are settled where we are and saying we have a consciousness of sin, therefore it doesn't work, as opposed to perhaps we have not experienced the relationship of Christ, which would give the experience and confidence of putting these sins behind us as forgiven. And I believe from my years of pastoring that perhaps one of the most kernel issues for a Christian is not the ability to accept forgiveness from God, but an ability to forgive ourselves, to accept that at the personal level, rather than, how could I have done that? I can't believe I did that. And to go back gnawing on the same stale old bone instead of walking with Christ and leaving the past in the past.
I just had an experience recently of meeting a good Adventist who'd been living a long time, and he was approaching death, and he was in a bit of a coma, but he kind of said to me, which was rather startling, have I committed the unpardonable sin? And he was a good man, a good Adventist. I conducted the funeral, and I just said to myself, are there any Adventists out there who come to the end of the road and are uncertain about salvation and are struggling with the consciousness of sin, or don't accept what Jesus has done for us? It should not be so, should it?
No, it shouldn't. I mean, yes, it shouldn't.
But let's not forget, there are 4 warning passages in this homily. So the problem of, if you will, post-baptismal sin in the life of the believer is still present.
We come to
and
that.
he will address that when we get to 10 and 26. Or if we willfully sin, we're going to get to that. So the problem of sin has not gone away for the believer.
It's not light on sin.
No, that's right. No, that's right. This is not a trivializing of the issue, which may imply that we still have a consciousness of sin. I mean, that comes with the territory. Even so, I think we're left with the ultimate question, is it possible that that lingering consciousness of sin turns out to mean more about us than about God or God's forgiveness?
I think so.
Is it partly part of what besets us as human beings, right?
Verse 10 says, by that will we have been sanctified through the offering. And Paul says, Christ is made unto us wisdom and righteousness and sanctification.
And so it turns out then that to be saved by grace through faith is not merely the initial faith of the acceptance of Christ's sacrifice. It is surely that. But it is also faith that says, no matter how I feel going forward, that I'm still convinced that God holds my hand and walks with me. We'll see you again next time on Searching for Answers.